The United States, 1941. A nation that had been isolated from the turmoil of war in Europe and the Pacific was about to be thrust into a global conflict that would change its history forever. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, led America into World War II, but it wasn't just soldiers fighting on distant shores.
The American home front, the heart of the nation, would become a battleground of its own kind. This is the story of how ordinary Americans from every corner of the country played a crucial role in winning the war.
For the people of the United States, the war was more than just a military campaign. It was the total mobilization of society. The United States didn't just contribute troops and leaders, it paid in material. As the world's leading democratic power, the U.S. became the primary supplier of arms, ammunition, food, and raw materials to the Allies. In 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established the Lend-Lease Act, which provided billions of dollars in aid to nations fighting the Axis powers, Mussolini in Italy, and the fascist Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. But it wasn't just about providing financial assistance. The U.S. would become the manufacturing powerhouse that would fuel the war effort. On the home front, factories that had once made consumer goods like cars and radios were transformed almost overnight into war production centers. Ford and General Motors switched from making automobiles to creating tanks, aircrafts, and jeeps. In total, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft, over 80,000 tanks, and countless vehicles and ammunition. By 1944, the United States was producing over half of all military equipment used by the Allied forces. War production also created many shortages in supplies. A key limited supply was the metal copper. Copper was used in the battlefield, and the military needed millions of miles of copper wire to communicate. To work around this, war planners, with the help of the U.S. Mint, helped solve the copper shortage. In 1943, it made pennies out of steel instead of copper. The U.S. Mint also conserved nickel by removing it from the 5-cent coin. Substitutions like these helped win the production battle. However, this transformation didn't just require labor. It needed a whole new workforce.
As millions of men enlisted or were drafted into military service, the workforce at home boomed with women. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter, a strong, determined woman, became a symbol of women empowerment and wartime unity. Women worked in factories, shipyards, and munition plants, taking on jobs that were once considered exclusively for men. By the end of the war, nearly 19 million women were employed, many in positions they would have not held before the war. They would become nurses, pilots, or even spies. Women joined the Women Air Force Service pilots and other auxiliary military branches, performing critical roles in support of the fighting forces. This period marked the beginning of a long shift in gender roles, which would continue into the post-war years. In the military, African American soldiers served in segregated units, with the famous Tuskegee Airmen among the few who broke barriers, becoming the first African American pilots in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Despite their exemplary service, racial prejudice persisted, both in the military and on the home front. However, the war sparked the beginning of the civil rights movement. Leaders like A. Philip Randolph, who organized a march on Washington to protest discrimination in war industries, helped shift public awareness about racial inequality. The 1941 march was ultimately called off after President Roosevelt signed an executive order banning discrimination in defense industries, but the fight for civil rights was far from over. Race relations were also affected by the government's decision to intern more than 100,000 Japanese Americans during the war. Fearing sabotage after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed an executive order forcing families to leave their homes on the West Coast and remote internment camps. The decision was widely criticized after the war, but it exposed the deep racial prejudices of the time, especially towards Asian Americans.
World War II not only shaped the modern world, it reshaped America itself. The war effort on the home front demonstrated the power of unity and the resilience of the American people.
When the war finally ended in 1945, the sacrifices made on the home front were clear. The United States emerged as a global superpower, having transformed its economy, workforce, and morale.